Gemini, your mission with this family is coming to an end. Get ready for a new beginning. Gemini, there are moments in life when something you've carried for so long, so naturally, so silently, suddenly feels heavier than it ever has. And in that shift, the truth begins to whisper. You didn't just grow up in your family. You served them, not in ways people may have seen, but in the energetic patterns you constantly managed, the emotional bridges you built, and the delicate balance you held between understanding and self-sacrifice. This was never just a family, it was a soul mission. And now, that mission is coming to an end. But what if I told you that this is not a loss, Gemini, but a liberation, that what feels like unraveling is actually a sacred return to you, your energy, your voice, your space, your life. I know how deeply you care, how often you've shaped yourself into what others needed, switching roles effortlessly, offering wisdom with a smile, translating chaos into harmony. But this time, the universe is translating something to you, a message of closure, a cosmic release. So if you've been feeling strangely detached, tired of dynamics that once defined you, or ready for something you can't quite name yet, this is your sign. Something is ending, and something so much bigger is beginning. Stay with me, Gemini. This story isn't about leaving anyone behind. It's about finally catching up to yourself. If you feel these words meeting you at just the right moment, like they were written for you, like they are you, then share and subscribe. This is not just a video. It's a turning point. Gate 1. The invisible role you've been playing all along. Gemini, you've always been a messenger, the connector, the translator, not just between words, but between people. In your family, this role wasn't assigned to you. It was something you quietly became. You learned early that tension could be diffused with humor, that misunderstandings could be soothed with perspective, and that if you stayed flexible enough, you could hold the threads of everything together. And so, you did, over and over again. Through holidays and heartbreaks, miscommunications and silences, you were the one who turned confusion into clarity, chaos into conversation. But what you didn't always realize is that this role, this mission, wasn't just a behavioral habit. It was a soul contract, one you entered into long before you were born. You chose this family because something in their pattern needed the frequency of you, not just your logic or your lightness, but your duality, your ability to see both sides, to hold complexity, to say what others couldn't. In a household where truths were buried or unspoken, you carried the courage to name them. In a family that feared change, you embodied possibility. You may not have always been thanked for it. In fact, many times, you were misunderstood. Your adaptability was mistaken for flightiness, your truth for disruption, your independence for detachment. But you kept showing up. You absorbed their needs like signals in the air, adjusting, softening, sometimes silencing your own truth so that others wouldn't fall apart. And this is what no one tells you, Gemini. That kind of care takes a toll. Being the emotional translator for a family system, especially one that resists evolution, is exhausting. You learn to shift shape, to say the right thing, to be what each person needed in the moment. And while that ability is beautiful, it also left you fragmented, disconnected from the center of your own voice, your own needs. Think back, Gemini. How many times did you walk away from a family gathering feeling emotionally drained, like you've been everyone's mirror but had forgotten your own face? How many moments did you bite your tongue to avoid conflict, even when you were right? How many decisions did you delay because someone else's feelings took priority over your own clarity? There's a reason for that. You weren't just trying to keep the peace. You were fulfilling a karmic role, a role that at its highest vibration offered healing, closure, and unity. You were the energy that allowed your family to say things they couldn't say to each other directly. You were the safe space where unspoken truths could briefly surface without burning the house down. You were the balance, the breath, the buffer. And here's the truth that changes everything. That mission is complete. You did it, Gemini, not perfectly, because no one was meant to, but with heart, with intelligence, with soul. You showed up when it mattered. You diffused what could have broken apart generations. And now, the ties that once needed your presence to stay whole are ready to stand on their own, or fall, as they were always meant to, so that something stronger can rise. You may have noticed it already. The shift, the way certain conversations feel repetitive, the way emotional labor no longer feels sustainable. The growing urge to say no without explaining. These are not signs of rebellion. They are signs of release. Your energy is no longer required in the same way. Your soul is redirecting. This doesn't mean abandoning your family. It means evolving the contract. You are allowed to step back. You are allowed to prioritize your own growth now. The role you once played was sacred, but it was never meant to be permanent. You're not just a translator anymore, Gemini. You're the author of your own new language, and this next chapter will speak directly to you. Are you ready to meet yourself beyond the role you played? Beyond the expectations you absorbed? Beyond the mission that has now reached its divine conclusion? Gate 2, the patterns you inherited and the freedom they've cost you. Gemini, you are someone who sees life through 1,000 lenses. You observe everything. The unsaid glances across the dinner table, the tone behind the words, the emotional shifts that others ignore. But what happens when you spend years sensing other people's inner worlds, yet suppress your own? What happens when your brilliance is poured into keeping the family dynamic afloat, while your own identity quietly recedes into background? That's what we need to explore here, because this is a hidden cost of the role you've been playing. There's a truth that many people overlook about you, Gemini. For all your brightness, your wit, your communicative ease, there's a side of you that carries deep ancestral memory. You've inherited patterns, some spoken, others woven silently into threads of your lineage. Perhaps it was the unhealed grief of a parent who never received validation, the silent pressure to always be agreeable, the unsaid rule that you had to be the easy one, the peacekeeper, the one who diffused tension with jokes or clever redirection. And so you adjusted. You made space for others. You filled in the gaps they didn't even realize they had. You became the flexible one, the helpful one, the adaptable one, the emotionally intelligent child who always knew better. But here's the hard truth. Being emotionally intelligent doesn't mean you should have had to parent your parents or hold the emotional weight of your siblings, or become the fixer of every unspoken wound in the room. Let that sink in for a moment. Because what began as compassion turned into a subtle self-erasure. You became so good at reading the room that you stopped asking yourself what you actually felt. You anticipated everyone's needs so often that your own became blurry, neglected, or postponed indefinitely. You told yourself that later, someday, you would get to live freely, wildly, without guilt. But Gemini, someday never comes until you name it. And this is your moment to do exactly that. Look back. How many times have you paused your dreams because someone needed you? How many times have you swallowed your truth because it didn't fit the family narrative? How many times have you laughed through the ache in your chest, telling yourself it wasn't the right time to bring it up because someone else was hurting more? This isn't weakness. It's deep empathy. But even empathy has a limit before it turns into martyrdom. And what hurts most is that the people you supported may not even realize the extent of what you've carried. They may see the light-hearted, capable version of you, the one who always figures things out, who always shows up, who never seems to break. But they haven't always seen the quiet grief, the ache of not being truly seen for your complexity, the frustration of feeling like you're never allowed to fall apart. Gemini, it's time to question this inherited programming. You do not need to shrink to keep the peace. You do not need to silence your desires so others can feel secure. You do not need to carry the weight of people who are capable of walking on their own, but have leaned on you for so long they've forgotten how. This is a crossroads. Keep living in those old patterns or begin dismantling them gently but decisively. And dismantling doesn't mean becoming cold or harsh. In fact, it means becoming honest. Honest with yourself about what you can and cannot give. Honest about the ways you've made yourself small. Honest about your right to say, I love you, but I can no longer make my life revolve around your unspoken expectations. The most liberating part of this awakening is that you don't have to justify it. You don't need to defend your boundaries. You don't have to argue for your freedom. It is inherent. It belongs to you. You were not born to be the silent support beam of a family house built on outdated values. You were born to build your own home. One where your truth, your dreams, your voice, and your joy are not conditional, not dependent, not postponed. Yes, some people in your life may resist a change. That's natural. When someone who has always been available starts choosing themselves, it rattles the system. But let it rattle. Let the old roles crumble. Let the story shift. Because you are not the same person you were when this mission began. And you are no longer willing to pay for peace with your own postponement. Gemini, this is not selfishness. This is sovereignty. You are ready to be free. And your freedom, believe it or not, is what will inspire those around you to find their own. Gate 3, the next chapter self. Who are you without the role? Gemini, if you're feeling both exhilarated and terrified right now, it means you're standing at the edge of your own becoming. You've spent years, maybe even decades, playing a role assigned to you by emotional inheritance. The communicator, the harmonizer, the light in the room when everyone else grew dim. But now that the mission is ending, the real question arises. Who are you when you're no longer a mirror but the flame itself? This is where things get beautifully uncomfortable. Because liberation is not just a matter of walking away. It's about walking towards something else. And for you, Gemini, that something else is yourself. Not the self who accommodates, adjusts, and entertains. Not the self who survives by scanning every emotional frequency in the room. But the self who simply is, without permission, without performance, and without apology. You see, when a Gemini begins to peel back the roles they play for others, a very different energy begins to rise. It's bold, creative, and deeply individual. It's the part of you that longed to be an artist, a teacher, a wanderer, a lover who doesn't dim their fire to keep someone else comfortable. It's the part of you that felt buried beneath shoulds and musts, but now begins to breathe again, stretching like sunlight across a room you forgot existed. I want to tell you something radical, Gemini. You are allowed to be entirely new. You are allowed to evolve beyond what your family understands. You are allowed to choose experiences that confuse the people who thought they knew you. You are allowed to say, that chapter shaped me, but it no longer defines me. In fact, you are meant to, because you are not just here to learn through the family you were born into. You are here to create a life so rich, so layered, so original, that it becomes a constellation unto itself. But there's an important step in this unfolding, and that's grieving. Yes, grieving. Not just the people or dynamics you're letting go of, but the identity that was so deeply woven into those dynamics. You might miss the predictability of being needed. You might miss the illusion of control. You might even miss the chaos, because at least you knew who you were inside it. And that's okay. It's okay to feel lost for a little while. It's okay to cry not only because something ended, but because you're afraid of not knowing what comes next. But you don't have to rush into clarity. That's the beauty of where you are now. You are in the liminal space, the chrysalis between what was and what will be. And in this sacred in-between, your only job is to listen. Listen to the stirrings inside you. Listen to the ideas you once called impractical. Listen to the relationships that make you feel seen, not simply needed. Listen to silence that invites you to write, to dance, to move, to wander, to choose. Because what is rising in you now is not another role. It is a voice, and it's your own. Do you remember, Gemini, when you used to dream without checking how those dreams would impact everyone else? Do you remember that spark of wanting to move cities, start that creative project, learn that language, say yes to something utterly unexpected? That part of you never died. It simply fell asleep under the weight of responsibility. But now, the responsibility is lifting. The mission is complete. The slate is being cleared, not just so you can rest, but so you can reinvent. You may feel awkward at first. People may ask you questions you don't know how to answer. What are you doing next? Why are you pulling back? Why are you different? Let them wonder. You don't owe them clarity while you're still in the dance of rediscovery. You are not late. You are not lost. You are becoming. And as you do, you may be surprised at how much space there is inside you. Space you can now fill with truth instead of obligation, with passion instead of peacekeeping, with boldness instead of balance. You might notice that your conversations shift. You begin attracting people who speak your language, not just your words, but your soul frequency. You begin finding new kinds of family, not by blood, but by resonance. People who don't need you to play a role, but who celebrate you for existing freely and fully. That, Gemini, is where you're going. That is what this next chapter is about. It's not about proving your worth. You've done that. It's not about earning your freedom. You've paid for it. It's about living in the truth that your soul is vast, wild, and sovereign, and it no longer needs to anchor itself in the needs of others to feel real. You have graduated from the story you were born into. Now it's time to author the story your spirit has been waiting to write. Gate 4, the art of drawing boundaries. From emotional servant to sovereign soul. Gemini, now that you are stepping into the wilderness of your own becoming, there's a sacred skill you must reclaim. One you were never really taught, only subtly discouraged from mastering. That skill is the art of drawing boundaries. For years, your generosity was praised, your adaptability celebrated, your willingness to show up again and again, even when it cost you, was quietly relied upon by those who knew you would never say no. But now, your evolution demands something entirely different. It asks that you begin choosing yourself, unapologetically and with conviction. And here's the truth you probably always known but rarely allowed yourself to act on. Boundaries are not walls that keep people out. They are bridges that protect your energy, your dreams, your time, and your spirit. They are the sacred contracts that define where you end and others begin. And if you are on to this new chapter, Gemini, your first act must be to build these bridges with clarity, not guilt. Let me say something radical to your heart. You are allowed to stop being accessible to everyone all the time. You are allowed to let calls go unanswered, to leave messages on read, to say, "Not today," without explanation. You are allowed to reclaim your mornings, your weekends, your creative hours. You are allowed to say, "I love you, but I cannot carry this for you anymore." Because what most people don't realize is that emotional availability, when unguarded, becomes a drain on your soul. You were never designed to be a permanent outlet for everyone else's emotional electricity. And when you try to be, your own internal current flickers and fades. This is why you felt so tired, so distracted, so restless, because your soul is tired being squeezed into service. It's begging to expand. But drawing boundaries doesn't mean you have to become cold or distant. In fact, boundaries make you warmer, more present, more intentional. Why? Because when you say yes, it comes from a full cup, not from obligation, not from resentment, but from truth. Some people will resist your new edges. They'll try to make you feel guilty because the old version of you was convenient for their emotional comfort. But hear me, their discomfort is not your responsibility. Their confusion is not a signal that you're wrong. Their withdrawal is not a sign you failed. It is simply the natural consequence of growth. There may be moments when you question yourself, when you feel the familiar ache of wanting to rush in and make everything better. You'll be tempted to smooth things over, to explain yourself, to shrink again so others can feel tall. But remember, Gemini, the people who truly love you will adjust to your growth. The people who truly respect you will respect your no. And the people who are meant to walk with you into this new era will not be intimidated by your authenticity. Let's speak practically. What does boundary setting look like for someone like you, Gemini? Someone who has spent a lifetime absorbing others' emotions, shape-shifting to meet their needs. It starts small, saying no to things that leave you drained, turning down invitations that don't align with your current values, protecting your creative time like it's sacred, which it is, allowing yourself to rest even when others are in chaos, pausing before you offer to fix, to help, to carry what isn't yours, watching your own impulse to explain or justify your choices, and instead, simply letting them be. It might mean redefining your family dynamics, being honest when you feel taken for granted, refusing to mediate conflicts that aren't yours to solve, letting people handle the messes they created instead of rescuing them. It might mean having difficult conversations where you say things like, "I love you, but I'm no longer available in the same way," or "I need to protect my peace, even if that means disappointing you." These are not easy things to say, but they are the doorway to peace. Real peace. Not the kind you pretend to feel so others can remain comfortable, but the kind that lives in your bones. Gemini, you have a gift for communication. Use it. Use it to express your truth, not just accommodate others. Use it to name your needs, your desires, your limits. Because when you start speaking your truth aloud, something miraculous happens. Your inner world and outer life begin to match. You begin to attract people who hear you the first time, who meet you in your wholeness, not your performance. You start experiencing relationships based on choice, not emotional debt. You begin to belong not because you bend, but because you be. It's important to know that setting boundaries may temporarily feel like losing people. And in some cases, you will, but you will never lose the ones meant for your future. The ones who are aligned with your growth will rise to meet you there. So don't be afraid of the quiet that comes when you stop overgiving. That silence is sacred. That space is where your spirit will speak again. That is where your creativity will return. Your joy will blossom. Your curiosity will rise like morning light. And in that stillness, you'll hear something you haven't heard in a long time. Your own voice. The one that says, "This is who I am. This is what I need. This is what I choose." And you'll know, without question, that you're no longer asking for permission to exist. You're claiming your place in the world, not as a caretaker, not as a problem solver, but as a radiant, whole, evolving human being you were always meant to be. Gate 5. Building a life that reflects the real you. Integration, liberation, and the joy of becoming. Gemini, now that you've learned to recognize your role, reclaim your boundaries, and release the emotional scaffolding that once held up others at the cost of yourself, the question becomes, what kind of life are you building now that it belongs entirely to you? You spent so long tuning yourself to the needs, moods, and crises of those around you that silence may feel unfamiliar. Stillness may feel unsettling. But make no mistake, this is not emptiness. This is space. And in that space, something astonishing is beginning to form. A life that finally fits the shape of your soul. Your spirit was never meant to live inside a schedule of obligations and emotional firefighting. You are a storyteller, a seeker, a bridge between realms. You are here not to fix people's wounds, but to inspire their healing through your example. This final gate is your invitation to step fully into your power, not as someone who serves from depletion, but as someone who radiates from wholeness. Integration for you begins with honesty, radical, compassionate honesty. It means asking yourself questions you used to avoid. What do I actually want? What lights me up? Whose voice has been guiding my choices all these years? And is it even mine? It's time to retrieve your voice from all the roles you've been playing, to stop performing and start living. The Gemini heart is wired for evolution. You are not here to remain stagnant in a single identity. You are here to explore, reinvent, and expand into the infinite versions of yourself waiting beyond habit and history. This next phase of your life is about experimenting with joy. Yes, joy, not obligation. What if your decisions weren't based on who needs you most, but on what makes your heart leap? What if productivity wasn't your metric for worth, but rather presence, wonder, and curiosity? Start small. Rebuild your routines around beauty and rest. Protect your mornings like they are sacred. Say yes to creative pursuits, even if they don't earn approval or income. Begin treating your joy not as a luxury, but as a requirement. You've lived long enough with heaviness. Let lightness become your new anchor. You might feel unsure at first. After all, for someone so deeply trained in taking care of others, making choices solely for yourself can feel rebellious, selfish, even. But Gemini, true selfishness is not choosing your own joy. It's expecting others to carry your unmet needs because you refuse to honor them yourself. The most generous thing you can do now is build a life that fills you up from the inside out, because from that place, your love becomes clean. It is no longer tethered to guilt or expectation. It simply flows. In this new version of your life, relationships change. Some will fall away, gently and inevitably. Others will deepen, but new ones will emerge. Relationships where you are not seen as a utility or an emotional crutch, but as an equal, a mirror, a soul in evolution. You will attract those who celebrate your boundaries instead of challenging them. People who don't need you to shrink, but who marvel at your expansion. This is the era of reciprocal energy, of giving and receiving in equal measure. Professionally, you may feel drawn in new directions. Perhaps you will pursue work that reflects your gift of language, connection, and vision. Or maybe you'll take a leap into something entirely different, something no one expected from you, but that feels like home. Don't be afraid to disrupt your own patterns. You're not late. You're right on time to surprise yourself. The universe will meet your authenticity with opportunities that match its frequency. And spiritually, oh Gemini, this is where the magic unfolds. With the old roles dissolved and the new space claimed, your intuition begins to roar back to life. You start receiving insights not through the lens of survival, but through clarity. You no longer need the approval of others to know you're on the right path. Your inner compass is enough, and it's singing now. Listen closely. It will guide you to people, places, and experiences that your soul has longed for in silence. Your dreams will sharpen. Your rest will deepen. Your sense of self will root, not in who you've helped, but in who you've become. You'll notice a strange, beautiful phenomenon. Life starts cooperating. People respect your time. You don't have to hustle to be heard. You'll find yourself walking into rooms where you don't have to hide pieces of who you are. You'll begin to speak with a confidence that isn't volume. It's truth. And perhaps most tender of all, you'll learn to receive. This is the real work now. Receiving love without suspicion, compliments without deflection, help without guilt, letting others show up for you because they want to, not because they owe you. Your relationships will become gardens, not battlefields, places of nourishment, not performance. Gemini, you are not just reclaiming your time, you are reclaiming your life. And that life is not a second-hand version patched together through the emotional debris of others. It is your masterpiece, blooming in full color. Let this gate mark your full initiation into sovereignty, into liberation, into unapologetic radiance. You are no longer required to earn your place through self-sacrifice. You are the place, a living testament to what happens when someone finally chooses themselves. Conclusion, your liberation has already begun. Now walk into it fully. Gemini, take a deep breath. Let it reach the parts of you that have long held their breath for the sake of everyone else. You walk with such grace through storms that no one else saw. You've carried roles and responsibilities that were never truly yours. And still, you kept showing up with a smile, with a solution, with a word that soothed the room while your own spirit waited quietly in the corner. But that waiting is over. The version of you that gave everything to keep the peace is finally laying down the burden, not in defeat, but in triumph, because your soul knows now. You were never meant to be the emotional glue that held everything together. You were meant to fly free, to explore, to create, to feel fully alive in your own skin. This is the moment when the story changes. The moment when you stop trying to return to the person you were and begin to step into the person you were always becoming. Yes, it may feel unfamiliar at first, but unfamiliar does not mean wrong. It means you're growing, and growth, for someone with a heart as multifaceted and brilliant as yours, will always feel like both a homecoming and a revolution. You don't need to earn your worth by solving other people's chaos. You don't need to make yourself smaller so others feel more comfortable. You don't need to fear change just because it hasn't been scripted before. Your new life is being written in real time, and you are the one holding the pen. If this message touched something in you, I invite you to share in the comments. Your story, your realizations, your truth. It might be the exact medicine another Gemini needs to hear tonight. And if you're ready to keep walking this path of self-liberation and healing, subscribe to the channel now, because in the chapters ahead, we'll dive even deeper into how to live as the most empowered, radiant version of who you really are. You are not here to live halfway. You are not here to please at the cost of your light. You are here to embody wholeness, to live out loud, and to write a life that no longer asks for permission. This is your turning point, Gemini. Step into it, boldly, beautifully, fully.